Hello everybody and welcome to class today. We're going to try something a little bit different as I'm not in the classroom with you. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through a Prezi and allow you to take some notes. I'll try to move at a pace that is convenient to all of you, and hopefully you can catch on to most of what I say here in this presentation. If you miss some notes, we'll have a chance tomorrow to go ahead and clean some of this up. Today our topic we're going to talk about is the moving west of Americans after the Civil War. Now, why would someone want to move west? Well, there were a few main reasons why Americans were willing to give up their lives in the East and settle for a new one in the West. The first and most common reason why people were willing to move west at this time was displacement after the Civil War. A lot of people, whether they be young men or slaves, had no place to go when the war was over. Their farms had been burned or their livelihood had been lost. So they decided that maybe the West was a good place for them to go. We also have a lot of people who are heading to the West for religious freedom. Specifically at this time period, we're talking about the Mormons and their move to Utah. And then something that often isn't talked about, but is really a true reason why a lot of people moved west, is it was a shelter for outlaws. If you were in trouble in the East and the law was after you, we're now at a point in American history where law enforcement really can't track you across the entire country. So if you just moved further and further west, you could always start over again. This is going to be a pretty key concept as we move forward. The whole idea of moving west and starting a new life. So the question I'd ask next would be, how did the government treat Western settlement just before the war versus just after the war? And was there a difference? Well, before the war, the government was not at all in favor of Western settlement. Why do you think that is? We've talked about a couple key concepts that might help give you an idea why the government right before the Civil War did not want American citizens to move west. Any ideas? Remember that when citizens moved west, new states would have to be an eventuality. Territories grew in population, and they would want to come into the Union. And before the Civil War, the government was doing just about anything it could to keep new states from coming in so they wouldn't have to deal with the questions of slavery. Sectionalism ran the nation. After the war, however, it was seen as a way to solve a lot of America's problems. In fact, the American government at the end of the Civil War encouraged Western expansion. One of the first ways that they encouraged expansion into the West was with the passing of the Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864. Both of these were passed during the Civil War, if you notice the dates. What these two acts did was to provide 175 million acres of land to railroad companies so that they would develop railroads to the west and towns along the way. If we wanted people to move to the west, the first step was going to have to be giving them an option of a way to get there. Having to go horse and buggy was not feasible at this point. Which leads us to the Homestead Act of 1862, probably one of the most important pieces of legislation that was ever passed by the United States government. The Homestead Act was designed by Abraham Lincoln. Even though he designed it, it would not be put into place until after the war, after his death. The Homestead Act of 1862 essentially would give any American who wanted to settle in the West 160 acres of free land. Now, in order to get the 160 acres of land, you had to meet 4 criteria. First and foremost, you had to be 21 years old, and you had to either be a citizen of the United States or you had to be in the process of becoming a citizen of the United States. Give you a second to write. And third and fourth, in order to receive homestead land, you had to make some improvement on the land within the first 5 years, and you had to live there at least 6 months of the year per each year. They were attempting to make sure that individuals didn't go out and just take the land and then wait and eventually sell it to other people. The whole point of the Homestead Act was that the people who got the land would actually be living there on the land. By the year 1900, there were over 600,000 homesteaders. If you do the math, that essentially works out to about 80 million acres of the American West had been given away to our citizens. You could imagine that this was a huge benefit to certain groups of people, especially newly freed slaves and immigrants to the United States. In essence, anyone who was poor really benefited from this. And for trivial sake, just so you might know, when do you think the last homestead land was given out? If you had to guess a year, when are we looking at for the last of all of the homestead land? You might be surprised to find out it was actually in 1988 there was still homestead land available in Alaska. If you would apply for it, the government would still give you 160 acres of free land if you were willing to meet those 4 criteria. So many people wanted the land that was given away in the Homestead Act of 1862 that they were actually races for land. They would line a whole bunch of people up. They would shoot a gun off at noon, and people would ride horses off into the sunset looking for different plots of land. And when they found the land they wanted, they would drive a stake into the ground claiming it for themselves. The people who raced in these were actually called boomers because there was a land boom, so they were referred to as the boomers. Now, some people snuck across the line and actually cheated to get that land before other people's. So instead of boomers, the people who cheated and went before others were called Sooners. And for all of you college football fans, the Oklahoma University to this very day is known as the Sooners because most of this land was actually given away in the Oklahoma Territory. By 1890, settlements existed about every 10 miles out on the prairie. So as you could imagine, the density of our population was starting to get much higher out on the Great Plains. Now, there's a problem here, right? Hopefully, by some point now, you've started to think that maybe we have one big, large issue that we have yet to deal with all of these new settlements out on the prairie. That would be Native Americans, the fact that there were already people living there. And as we are taking land, there's a big cultural difference between the way we own land and the way that Native Americans of the Plains approached land ownership. Now at this point we're going to go ahead and pause, so I'd like somebody to please pause the video, and I want you to go ahead and read the handout that has 4 excerpts dealing with the views of land ownership. You don't have to follow any instructions on the sheet about doing anything. Just go ahead and read and maybe underline and look at some key concepts. When you're done reading, you should be able to answer the question, what is the difference in the view of land ownership between whites and natives? You can press pause now. Welcome back. So, what is the difference? Did you come up with some different things? Hopefully what you found out in reading is that white Americans actually viewed land ownership as a very real thing, that it was important to own the land, and if you owned the land, that meant that you were somewhere. As we've always learned, land equals power, and when you own it, that means something. Whereas Plains Indians of the Native Americans, they never really looked at viewing land as something that was possible, that land belonged to the spirits, and that it was possible maybe for you to own what was on the land, but ownership of the land itself was not something that you would look to do. Because of this, the government's solution was to form Indian reservations. The government wanted the land, the government wanted to give the land to American settlers, but in order to placate, in order to make the Indians happy, they gave them reservation land. So they set aside certain areas that were going to be reserved for the Native Americans to live on. Places where colonists would not settle, places where homestead land would not be available. So based on what you read, does this work? And obviously, or hopefully you figured out that the reservation system is not really popular with most Native Americans because it's really a foreign concept to say this is your land, this is the only land that you have, this is where you can stay. A lot of members of the American government thought that they were actually being very nice by saying, we'll go ahead and reserve land for you. But to Native Americans, it was actually quite an insult to put them on Indian reservations. Some groups fought back. Not all of the Native Americans were willing to go along. Probably the group that fought back the most was the Sioux Nation. It's spelled weird, guys, so make sure you write it down correctly. S-I-O-U-X, but it's pronounced Sioux. And the Sioux Nation was a group of tribes that existed throughout North and South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, in what is today those 4 states. Now, what's really important were the Sioux Indians were not against having whites settle in the West. In fact, they were a fairly friendly group of Native Americans. What they were against was the building of railroads, because to them, railroads caused some pretty serious issues. The Sioux Indians, like many other Plains Indians, make their livelihood by being hunters. They followed the herds of elk, the herds of buffalo, and railroad tracks would mess up, would change the migration patterns of these herds. And when railroads came through their lands, you would see your food source disappear. So the Sioux were trying to fight back against the American government, not to say you can't be here, but rather to say we don't want you to build railroads through our lands. The main chief of the Sioux Indians at this point was a man by the name of Chief Red Cloud. And there's a picture of him you can see. And things were pretty calm. Even though they were fighting, there wasn't much actual physical violence until gold was found in the Black Hills. Now, the Black Hills are in South Dakota and parts of North Dakota and Wyoming, and it's the major population area of the Sioux Indians. To this very day, there's huge gold reserves in the Black Hills. And when gold was found in the Black Hills, all of a sudden that land that belonged to the Sioux came under scrutiny of the U.S. government. In order to investigate, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer was sent to see if there was gold, what kind of resistance would be put up, whether or not they could get the land back. Red Cloud was actually in negotiations with Custer to buy the land back so that the land that belonged to the Sioux would be bought and the Sioux would move to different land. However, there were 2 other Sioux chiefs who were not so nice to Custer. One of them was a chief by the name of Sitting Bull, and the other was a man by the name of Crazy Horse. Well, Custer would chase these 2 gentlemen, these 2 chiefs, all the way to the Little Bighorn River in Montana, where he thought he had Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse cornered with only a few warriors. It turns out, however, that the Little Bighorn River was a Sioux stronghold, and Custer had walked into a trap. Custer at this point has 200 of his cavalrymen. This is the 7th Cavalry Division. And the Sioux were 2,000 men strong. And the Sioux, I want to make sure you guys don't picture, these Sioux warriors weren't tomahawks and bows and arrows. The Sioux warrior were on horseback, the same as Custer's men. And these Sioux warriors were using rifles, pistols, the same weaponry that Custer would have had at this time. This clash is referred to by one of 2 names. It's referred to as either the Battle of Little Bighorn or often Custer's Last Stand. Given the name Custer's Last Stand, you can kind of get an idea on how things worked out between them. It was not necessarily a good situation. I'll go back. Custer lost himself and all 200 of his men. They were all killed within this battle, whereas the Sioux actually had very insignificant casualties. Custer and his men all died. Crazy Horse was killed, and Sitting Bull would flee to Canada. Now, as you can imagine, the American government is not very happy about all of this, and the situation is not going to get better. When we meet again, we'll talk about how things change from there. But I'll tell you at this point, Sitting Bull is in Canada. He will eventually come back, and the situation will get much worse. If you have any questions on any of this, go ahead and write them down or think about them, and we will talk about them tomorrow. Hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you later.